Chapter 28. Tristan could not figure out how to make the damn folded ladder work, so he ended up bleeding like a lost goat for half an hour before one of the watchmen on patrol heard him. It was another 10 minutes after that of Lieutenant Vicente and her minions asking him through shouts to describe the device in detail, then failing to get that work. In the end, one of the blast cloaks just threw him a rope ladder, giving up the machinery for a lost cause. It was only watchman when he came down, with one exception, Mariam. It was a dangerous habit to start seeing what you wanted to see, so the thief did not let himself believe it was relief he saw in those blue eyes. They had chosen trust, but there was no guarantee that would last beyond the trials they were undertaking. The given hint that she had aimed from the start at cooperation in a greater undertaking was to be set aside. Then future was a foreign land, not to be relied upon. The dark-haired woman strode through the throng of blast cloaks, some of them snickering, and for a heartbeat it looked like she was going to embrace him. Instead she slapped his hat down against his chest. "There," Mariam said. "I tried to sell it, but it was such a raggedy thing I could find no takers." "Blind and a poor haggler, then," Tristan mused, setting it back on his head. "It's a lucky thing I made it back. What would you do without me?" "Luck," she said. "When the pebble stays stuck in your boot after the shake, is that what you call it?" A sigh, but not hers. Lieutenant Vicente wrinkled her nose at them. "I don't know what this is," she said, wiggling a finger in their direction, "but it's putting me off dinner." "Cease immediately." The thief tossed the lieutenant a carved stone button. She caught it, rather spry for her age. "It's a key," he told her. "Best to get a few muskets pointed at the door before using it, though. There's a god on the other side, and he simply cannot wait to have someone over for dinner." The old woman looked nonplussed. "That's what salt munitions are for," she said. "Good work, boy." "I live for your praise," Tristan dryly replied. Lieutenant Vicente wanted a detailed report, but he told her he wanted a physician first, so as a compromise he got to tell her about his misadventures while the garrison doctor saw to his broken finger. To his surprise, she seemed to care little about the god. It was the room with the tiles she was most interested in, demanding he describe it several times while taking notes, and one more detail besides, the metal rod with the alloy brand at the end. That she cared about so much she asked he draw the brand from memory. Tristan did, charcoal pen scratching against cheap paper. "It might not be exactly that," he warned. "I only saw it in passing." She hummed, eyes on the drawing as she only half listened. "What is it about the brand that interests you so much?" he asked. To his surprise, she deigned to answer. He had expected a cutting comment and a dismissal. People tend to think of the antediluvians as a nation of living gods, shaping the world to their whim, but that was only true for the First Empire's ruling class, Lieutenant Vicente said. Someone had to clean the dust off the wonders and keep the cogs turning. The urge to fiddle with the splint the physician had put around his broken finger was near overwhelming, but he forced himself to think instead. The man was gone back to the barracks. If the splint snapped, he was on his own. The rod was some kind of tool, then, Tristan deduced, cocking his head to the side. The greats of the First Empire could all manipulate ether much like navigators can shape the globe, Vicente told him. Their servants, though, were not so gifted. So how does a living god avoid having to get their own carriage working when the thing runs on ether? By making tools that can affect the ether, he said. That's what that brand is, boy, Lieutenant Vicente said, not hiding her excitement. It is our way to get one of the machines working without the need for a navigator. If we are lucky, it will have been crafted for the tiles and let us open the front gate heedless of hell's sabotage. The burst of enthusiasm waned, however, and with it the lieutenant's willingness to indulge his curiosity. She left him to his seat, telling him he was no longer needed for the afternoon, and went to consult with her band of followers. Tristan watched her back getting further and further away, considering how furious she would be should she ever learn he'd held back in his report. He had not told her of the second stone button in his pocket, or the green glass door. With Vicente's departure others were finally free to approach. Mariam and Vanessa both joined him at the table, the latter helped onto the seat by his pale-skinned accomplice. They seemed in a fine mood, Vanessa in particular. He quickly learned the survival was not the only reason. Everyone has been pulled off the sky watching, Vanessa told him. The lieutenant wants us studying mechanisms around the tiles on the iron gates. She believes they are some sort of combination lock. The old clockmaker, as it turned out, preferred steel to figures. She was glad to be back on the gates instead of continuing to match the sealing machine's movements to that of the inner cogs. Francho and I are still on the machine, but she is no longer insistent I start pushing gloom at it like a toddler throwing a ball, Mariam said. I do not suppose you know why? I might have found a tool that can serve in your place, Tristan said. Good news, Vanessa enthused. Once it is brought down, it is behind a locked gate guarded by a monstrous old god that tried to eat me, he told her. Ah, Vanessa muttered. That puts something of a damper on things, admittedly. Tristan scraped together a meal for the three of them out of what lay around the kitchen, mostly dried fruits and bread, but soon enough the pair's break was at an end. They still had work to do for Lieutenant Vicente, unlike him. Vanessa was the first to head back, giving them a knowing smile. Tristan supposed that the amount of plotting in dark corners the two of them did was not helping with that misunderstanding. When Mariam spoke, though, it immediately claimed his full attention. The use of your contract was too obvious not to be caught this time, she said. Already rumors are getting around, and your timely throw against the Bird has not been forgot. You might want to get ahead of this before speculation grows wild. Before someone described him the power to stop cogs with a thought, predict the future and maybe also fly, she meant. Nothing got so out of hand as rumors about contracts. Back home there were so many tales about what the legacy contracts of the Six could do that if all were true the nobles would be more divine than their own gods. Thankfully Tristan had a lie ready for this, the same he had been using for years when the need was forced on him. Telekinesis, he said without batting an eye. I can move small objects with some degree of strength, but I have difficulties with control and there is often backlash. Mariam cocked an eyebrow at him. His answer had been a little too quick to be believable. A lie, Tristan shrugged. But the effects are similar enough it would be difficult to argue otherwise. It does sound like the kind of contract with a minor god a man of no background might obtain, she admitted after a moment. It took genuine effort not to flinch when Fortuna slammed her fist on the table, which made not a sound and did not shake it, as it was only on his flesh she could feign to touch, and she leaned forward with flashing eyes, pointing an accusing finger at an unseeing Mariam. Minor? She shrieked. Minor? The goddess shook her finger angrily. How dare you, Mariam Kamov, she snarled. I was going to sell you to her on the cheap, Tristan, but this heresy cannot be brooked. You must defeat her in single combat. Avenge my honor, and be a brute about it. The thief sipped at his cup of water, smiling. Have I told you I like your tresses? He asked Mariam. They suit you well. She slowly blinked. Treachery, Fortuna sputtered, stumbling back in shock. Stop that, Tristan, stop that right now. You have very good taste in boots, he told Mariam. She squinted at him. Are you? She slowly said. Are you using me to anger your god? The gray-eyed man simply smiled and complimented her dress, Fortuna's indignant shouting like a soothing lullaby. Tristan spent most of the afternoon trying very hard not to fiddle with his broken finger, drinking dandelion tea and considering what he should do. It was only a matter of time, he figured, until Lieutenant Vicente tried again to be rid of him by sending him through the stone door. He could not be sure that the god would be lying there in wait, but it did seem likely. How long had it been since the entity last had an opportunity to feed? Worse, it did not seem to be affected by the laws the etheric machine above was subjecting the gods of the maze to. It had certainly not been shy in trying to gobble him up. No, the more he thought about it the more likely it seemed that the lieutenant would send him in. Vicente wouldn't use blast cloaks, no matter her talk of salt munitions, for the same simple reason she had not kept sending people to cross the same lethal machinery. Tristan barely survived. If too many got killed, There would be consequences she could not afford. As the thief did not fancy his chances against the god even if he was sent into, he would need to make other arrangements. First, he needed a sword hand. He and Mariam worked very well as a pair, but it could not be denied they were not the finest of fighters. Tristan knew of one man with the required capacity for violence, and that he still trusted more than most in the trial of ruins. The real question was this: had they made enough progress along this path that Young would consider them a better bet than continuing with the maze? After wrestling with the question for some time, sketching arguments for either side, he finally decided an answer could not be had until the crews returned tonight. If they returned tonight, he corrected as the hours stretched out. It was now late in the afternoon, and it was possible that some of the crews had got far enough in the maze that they would prefer to spend the night there rather than double back. Tristan was not afraid of anyone passing the second trial early, for it would be impossible for any single crew to have 10 victors, and they had all taken different paths. It was becoming clear, however, that he was running out of time for his other affairs. He had neglected vengeance in the name of more immediate dangers, but now that there was a light at the end of that tunnel he could turn his attention back to the business. Tristan had no intention of allowing the Sheridan brothers or Cosmoflora to live. The deal he had struck with Isabel should buy him the opening he needed, but he needed for the crews to return to the old fort before he could slither his way in. It was that understanding that had him keeping an eye out for any return until at last his patience was rewarded. More or less. Lord Augusto Sheridan, looking quite haggard, stumbled into the old fort come early evening. The Infanzon looked as if he had been thrown down the side of a mountain, boasting such an extensive collection of scrapes and bruises that the broken arm no longer stood out. The worst was a nasty rip going down the side of his now broken nose to halfway down his throat. The skin had been scraped off by something raw, and though it was not a dangerous wound it was one that would be disfiguring for months. He began calling for the watch physician within moments of entering, quite loudly. Tristan noted with amusement that the doctor in question pointedly took his time doing up his buttons before moving to answer, and was soon being seen to enter the kitchen. Lieutenant Vicente had released everyone for the evening, so it was not Tristan alone who came out to the courtyard to have a look at the Infanzon's bruises being cleaned with alcohol. Mariam drifted close, as if by coincidence, and leaned against the wall by his side. Alone and wounded, she idly said. Lord Augusto must be feeling rather exposed. Tristan knew little of the people of what the Milani called the northern colonies, the Triglav. Oh, islanders called them fierce savages who fought garbed in steel and raided settlements from the back of their hardy mountain ponies, but if you believed the Milani, every war they had ever fought had been against hateful villains, while the brave people of the Isles only ever reluctantly took up arms for the common good. You have to take the Milani with a grain of salt, for all that they rarely lied. Looking at the way those blue eyes were watching Augusto Sheridan, though, like a hunter watching a stag, measuring it for the knife, he thought there might be some truth to the stories out of the Isles. That was not the stare of someone who balked at the thought of violence, who saw anything wrong with the lay of Vesper being decided by the cut of a blade. Tristan supposed he should have been put off by the sight, but he was not. How could he be when he'd seen eyes like those all his life, saw them every time he looked in a mirror? People like Angharade Tredegar, like Augusto Sheridan or even Vanessa, they thought of violence as an intrusion, a break in the default state of peace. They had lived all their life behind the walls of the garden where laws mattered and served to protect, never grasping that beyond the wall violence was the law. You took from those who could not protect and kept what you could protect from those who would take it. That was the truth of Vesper, to a rat. Triglav, Tristan thought as he watched those pale blue eyes, must not have been so different. Very, he finally agreed, looking away. So much that I think him unlikely to leave the fort for some time. And while in here, protected by sanctuary, Tristan would not risk killing the Infanzon. The risks were too great when both lieutenants in command of the fort had it out for him. He will have to come out sooner or later, Mariam murmured. He is bound to the trials, Tristan pointed. To return home as anything but a peace concession in the making, he must survive his brother and Isabel Ruesta. If there is to be a list, he would be last. So the younger must come first, she murmured. The thief was somewhat impressed she had caught that. Raymond Sheridan must indeed come before an attempt on Cosmoflora could be made. His two enemies under Tredegar were the hardest to get at, by virtue of the mirror dancer being their protector, but with Isabel out to get Raymond killed he would have someone interfering on his behalf. More importantly, it would force Cosmo to move. After that, the man would have two choices: either he swallowed his pride and went to Augusto, to get at least one Sheridan home and hope it would be enough, or he cut ties with House Sheridan entirely and tried for the watch as a refuge. If he went to Augusto he became easier to get at, as Tupac Sickle had all the loyalty of a jackal, and if Cosmo aimed for the watch then Tristan would have the entire third trial to get to him. There are plans in the works, he said. Very sinister, Mariam praised. Have you considered growing a beard so you might stroke it? Huh? Fortuna snorted from behind him. He wishes. The Lady of Long Odds had entirely forgot her sworn enmity of a few hours ago, as was her way, and was not merrily siding against him once more. The thief rolled his eyes. Come, he said. Let us see what our good friend Lord Augusto has to say. The eldest Sheridan was not only inclined to talk but rather vigorously friendly. He spun a tale of woe, telling all four of them, Vanessa and Franco, curious, also joined them at the table, of the many indignities he had suffered since Angharate Tredegar's false accusations forced him to make common cause with the bandit Tupac Sickle. Going with the Aslan had been what he wanted, he assured them. She even got to Lord Ishan, you see, Augusto told them. A nice enough man but very gullible. He had no chance at all against as skilled a trickster as Lady Angharade. Tristan had known heads of cabbage more skilled at trickery than Angharate Tredegar, but he smiled encouragingly instead of laughing in the man's face. He need not look around to see the obvious fabrication had found no takers, the perjury was widely respected. The Infanzon told them of Tupac being a slave driver with no regard for a rank, of Felix being insolent and insubordinate while Ains was useless. However obtuse, Augusto soon realized that insulting the married pair everyone here had spent the first trial with won him no friends. He immediately changed tack, focusing on the shrines and the gods. The Infanzon revealed nothing that Tristan had not already heard from Lan, save when it came to today's events. Tupac's crew had made very fine progress after crossing a broken bridge, Augusto recounted, but then been forced to go underground and wait for some time before they were let into some kind of crystal labyrinth. And there had been illusions and attacks, until the entire thing collapsed onto their heads. Augusto has narrowly survived, buried alive but falling through a crevice. From there he had stumbled into some manner of empty crypt and found a path back to the old fort. I now hold the knowledge of a safe route deep into the maze, Augusto told them. There is but a single shrine on the way, and I have defeated the god's test. I stand before you a victor. He was, in fact, sitting, and carefully avoiding giving any specifics about the shrine he had beaten, enough that Tristan suspected he was either lying or it has been mortifyingly easy to defeat. It was when, between two boasts of knowing a crucial path, Augusto half-heartedly apologized for sending Tristan away from his group during the trial of lines. The thief was informed that Tredegar had insisted and convinced the others, so Augusto's hand had been forced, that Tristan realized what the noble was after. Why, Augusto nonchalantly said, I expect that the path is so easy even the five of us could reach the end of the maze using it. The man was in the market for a delving crew, preferably full of expendables, and under his captaincy. Tristan could only wonder if it was desperation or arrogance that had the Infanzon thinking there was anyone left that might want to go under him. How impressive, Mariam mildly said. As he did about half the time he glanced her way, Augusto smothered a moe of disgust at the paleness of her skin. Indeed, the eldest Sheridan agreed. But it is my duty as an Infanzon to provide for others. Franco almost choked on the water he had been drinking. He coughed under Augusto's suspicious eye. The cough simply won't leave me, the toothless old man said. I did not mean to interrupt, my lord, do go on. Oh, but I have talked quite enough I think, Augusto said. What is it that the four of you have been doing, if not seeking to pass the trial? I saw the blessed cloaks made some sort of discovery. Lieutenant Vicente had yet to manage to get the folded ladder to unfold, but the rope ladder was easy enough to see. We have been given tasks by Lieutenant Vicente to advance the watch's interests in this place, Tristan replied. Secrecy is paramount, I am sure you understand. He glanced at the others, who looked willing enough to follow his lead in this. Of course, Augusto said, frowning when no one else added anything. Though I imagine you will be free by tomorrow. That is not for us to determine, my lord, Tristan said. We are in the service of the old fort's commanding officer until released. The bruised noble looked at the others, seeking someone who might contradict what had been said, but instead only got silence. Looking miffed but knowing better than to push his luck when his position was so weak and a watch lieutenant was involved, Augusto gave way. He changed the subject, returning to complaints about his old crew. Tristan thought there might be a purpose to it, at first, but eventually came to realize that the noble mostly wanted to vent. Miriam and Franco excused themselves before long, but the thief forced himself to remain in case anything of use was revealed. Vanessa, he suspected, simply pitied him enough to suffer through the whining. Both of the Estlanar's wild animals, Augusto told them. Sickle is from Eastcley, so that was only to be expected, but Ocotlan is no better even after a lifetime under enlightened rule. Ocotlan's tattoos and build marked him as legbreaker for the Menromano, one of the largest coteries in Sacramonte, so Tristan was thoroughly unsurprised. The Mono liked their enforcers brutal. Life in the Merc can be very difficult, Vanessa said. Not all who resort to violence enjoy it, Lord Augusto. That man does, Augusto haughtily replied. He spent much time boasting of the work he had done for his patrons, bloody stories that had him grinning and chuckling. He proudly told me of beating a man to death before his son and of drowning another in a waste bucket. That sounded about right, the thief thought, and his interest waned entirely. What did he care of an Infanzon shock at the true face of the city he looked so like to claim having turned into a paradise? Augusto Sheridan would have gone his entire life without caring a whit about what took place in the Merc every day, if he had not been told of it. In truth he still cared nothing, Tristan knew, and only used the talk of savagery as a way to complain of his former companions. If he somehow survived the Dominion and returned to the Sheridan, the Infanzon would forget everything he had learned in matter of hours. The thing with mud was that when you were a noble you had servants to wipe it off your boots. And he bragged of having done work for his patrons even after they had decided to send him off to these cursed trials, Augusto bit out. Breaking the leg of some Vanessa might be willing to indulge the fool, but Tristan's patience ran out. He feigned having been called by Miriam and went her way, sending the clockmaker an apologetic glance that she did not notice. Was she truly interested in the Sheridan's words? Surely she could not be as spellbound as she looked. Vanessa was too kind for her own good, he thought, not for the first time. The older of the Sheridan brothers certainly seemed pleased at having such a willing audience, almost eager to answer her questions. Tristan might have pitied him for being so obviously starved of regard, had he not been a Sheridan. The man was of that accursed house, however, so instead the thief put it out of his mind and went to attend to one of the secrets he dug up. Keeping one of the stone buttons he had taken in the pillar was not much different from keeping a key behind Lieutenant Vicente's back, in practice, as he could do little with the object but open a door. It was a way to get to the secrets, not a bearer of secrets itself. For him, anyway. Franco, who could listen to the voices in stone, would find it otherwise. The old man was not hard to find, he was napping in his bedroll, snoring quite loudly. Tristan almost felt bad about waking him up, but the sooner he had answers the sooner he could begin to sketch out the end of this trial. The toothless professor smacked his lips as he was gently shaken awake, eyes unseeing for a moment before he woke entirely. Trist, he began, then fell into a fit of coughing. The thief waited for them to end, then caught the man's eye. You will have a hard time having a good night's sleep, if you nap for too long, he said as he pressed the stone button into the man's hand. Franco's eyes widened but he caught on quick. That is true, I suppose, the old man said. Perhaps I should go for a walk. Any suggestions? Where is this from? As long as it's not up in the pillar, Tristan said, feigning a small laugh. The god there would not make for a fine company. Not much of an answer, Franco snorted. Should I ask the lieutenant? Does Vicente know about this? Surely not, Tristan said. She might take it as advances. It is never too late for love, my boy, Franco laughed. Good, they were now on the same page. Tristan drew back, offering a hand to help the old man up. Franco took it, letting himself be pulled close. Too faint, the old man murmured. It will take me hours to make out the words, come back tonight. Inclining his head in agreement, the thief smiled. He could wait. It took longer than Franco had said. The professor came to talk only an hour before midnight. They sat at a kitchen table sharing a bowl of capacitas, the old Ayergan classic of crispy mushroom slices. These were in the Sacramontan style, salt but no pepper, and just like back home the garrison kept them by the barrel. Franco was toothless, so he broke the crisps with his lips and sucked on them until they were so mushy he could slurp them down. It wasn't appetizing to look at, but the slow pace would give them an excuse to sit here until they were done talking. The history of this place, Franco said, comes in 3 parts. He traced a circle on the table before breaking off another piece of cabecita. First is an island on what was not yet the Tribbean Sea, he says. The antediluvians, for reasons known only to them, build this pillar in the etheric machine. Then comes the old night, and as the first empire falls the island is abandoned. And the devils come, Tristan said. And the devils come, Franco agreed. They get into the pillar, tinker with the great machine, then break the doors so that no one else can do the same. They then build the old fort and begin the centuries-long labor of building the maze. The old man paused. Only it is not so simple as that, the professor said. None know for sure what took place during the old night, if the flood truly took place or if it's mythology, but it is beyond debate that the fall of the First Empire caused mass migrations of people and darklings. It is during this era that the islands of the Tribbean Sea first begin to see settling, among them this very Villa Perdida. And the devils simply let them? Tristan frowned. There would not have been many of them, Franco shrugged. These settlers, not darklings, at least not yet, would be the same people that built the circles of raised stones, and I believe them to have been, if not friends to the devils, at least not enemies. Tristan took a moment to swallow that. All his life he had been told of the wickedness of devils, that they could not be trusted. They were not like hollows, who could be bargained and lived with, but something fundamentally evil. Even the devils who had signed the Iscariot Accords and been allowed to live among humans beyond the walls of Pandemonium were only biding their time until they began to devour men again. But it might have been different back then, he thought. It could not be denied that devils preyed on men, but so did other men. In a time of bloody chaos like the old night, would the settlers have seen hell's denizens as all that worse than their other enemies? It is said that the Watch took this island from hollows, not men, the thief noted. It is a common and well-documented phenomenon for the population of islands without a natural source of glare to progressively turn hollow over the span of generations, Franco dismissed. I imagine that the cultists of our day are descended from those very settlers, twisted by centuries in the dark. Tristan slowly nodded. I take it the 3rd part is when the Watch arrives, he said. After the signing of the Iscariot Accords, the Blesscloaks built the Rookery as the seat of their order and began spreading their influence across the Tribbean Sea, Franco said. I will spare you a history lesson about the Order's conflicts with Sacramonte, in those days still attempting to revive the Second Empire, and say only that most of the Watch's power in those days was still bound east, to the century-long siege of Pandemonium and its later sealing. They did not have coin or manpower to waste, Tristan translated. Yet they still came here and seized the dominion from devils and darklings. Why? This, he thought, was the threat to pull at. If he could learn why had the Watch come and why it had stayed, everything else would fall into place. I have spent the last 3 hours, Franco said, figuring out the answer to that question by listening to the voices of the devils who once used your button. It all comes down to a very slight mistake, Tristan. that compounded over centuries. The toothless professor shivered, slurping down his piece of mushroom and subtly pressing the stone button against the side of the bowl as he reached for another crisp. Tristan palmed it just as discreetly, then waited as Franco began to violently cough. It was only after a minute of long breaths that the old man opened his eyes and began to speak. When the Blastcloaks first came to P28-P30, he rasped, the darklings who dwelled on it spoke what is called a Trebian cant. That is to say, one of the family of languages descended from what was spoken here during the First Empire. Traces of that root language, Tristan, remain all across the Trebian Sea. The Asphodel Rectorate, for example, still uses such a cant for its formal ceremonies. There was a mistranslation of some kind, Tristan guessed. The word was one the ancestors of the Darklings learned from devils, which the Watch would have recognized, Franco said. But then the island was isolated for centuries. Their accent grew, so when the Blastcloaks asked their questions half the terms were misconstrued. He paused. When we encountered cultists, Tristan, did you notice they scarred and tattooed themselves? With a red eye, Tristan agreed, then frowned. He remembered the mace-wielding cultists that might have killed him if not for Miriam's use of a sign, the way his cheeks had been scarred with red ellipses. But would Tristan have called them mace, had he not already known the hollow belonged to a cult of that name? It's not an eye, is it? He asked. Franco smiled. Mouth, he said. Or perhaps maw. It is the god the cult worships, and likely the rumor the Watch first came here to investigate. And now it all began to make sense. You told me the circles of raised stones the settlers built were built by the river because rivers are boundaries, Tristan said. That it could mean the boundary was being either weakened or strengthened. And it had to be strengthened, for the Erevatan to have been kept out by their mere existence. The same settlers who had raised those stones had been on good terms with the devils, Franco had just told him, and the shape of it all lit up in his mind's eye. I believe they were built, Franco said, for the very same reason the devils built their maze. The heart of that god lies beneath this cavern, under the mountain. Gods, how large was the red maw? It must be miles long, to reach as far as the river while its heart pulsed beneath their feet. Only the oldest of deities grew so large as to, no, that was a distraction from what truly mattered. The layers of schemes, accumulated over the centuries like sediment at the bottom of a canal. The devils did not want this god loose, but they had not killed it, or perhaps they had been unable to? Yes, that seemed more likely. So instead they had imprisoned the red maw, doing something with the golden ether machine and barring the pillar's gates so it could not be undone before building a maze over the red maw's heart. A maze full of hungry gods, Tristan thought, who the machine above forced to eat not humans or hollows but only the divine. The gods of the shrines are meant to eat away at the red maw, he murmured. That's why the devils kept bringing more and more temples over the centuries. They were replacing those that the red maw ate to keep the prison functional. Franco slowly nodded. The Watch has not done the same, he said. It would have been impossible to hide moving entire shrines to this island with any regularity, and I cannot even conceive how they would achieve such a thing in the first place. Not through the way their crew had entered this cavern by, no, and it did seem to be the way the Watch used to get to the old fort. No, Tristan slowly said. They have not, so the prison would weaken over time. But they did start doing something else, after taking the Dominion. The trials. The fucking trials. The Watch couldn't bring in entire shrines and the gods bound to them, so sooner or later the red maw would devour all the gods, keeping it from spreading. It was older, more powerful. It could afford a war of attrition, and that was the nature of this prison, gods slowly starving and clawing at each other. So instead the Watch had looked for a way to bolster the strength of the maze gods, to help them against the red maw, and in looking found a loophole in the laws imposed by the ether machine. The trials were just a way to keep drawing people to the Dominion so enough of them would make it to the second trial and die, keeping the shrine gods strong. The overly large Watch investment on the island, the seemingly backwards method of recruitment, they were all explained if you stopped looking at the Dominion of Lost Things as trials and instead considered it a prison. The blessed folks willingly paid in gold and lives every year because otherwise this red maw might break the lock on its prison and become a much larger problem, one they must not know how to kill, because if they could have by now they most definitely would have. Yearly sacrifices, Franco softly said. Keeping the seal strong. Tristan's fingers clenched. We cannot reveal this, he said. They might well kill us to keep it quiet. If the true nature of what took place on the dominion of lost things spread, the consequences would be. Tristan could not quite grasp what the watch as a whole might suffer. It was too grand a scope for that, but at the very least the flow of trial takers would run dry. Not even pride and tradition would make the Infanzones keep feeding their children to some savage old god as they unknowingly had for centuries. Or did the Infanzones know? No, it could not have remained a secret if that were true. But if it were only the lords and ladies of the Six, well, that might be a different story. A conspiracy for another time. I will speak not a word, Franco promised. Tristan let out a long breath, passing a hand through his hair. He had no fear of that. The old man no more wanted to be dragged out back and shot than he did. Best to change the subject, for lingering on it would only serve to unnerve them. It is almost shame you cannot, Tristan said. Imagine what a book it would make. The university would surely beg for you to return. Franco's face closed, but not at the mention of the University of Ref. It was the mention of a book that had him looking almost bitter, and Tristan hid his interest. For all that the man was free with amusing stories, the professor's past was still largely opaque to him. I suppose it is only fair to say, the toothless old man sighed, since we already share so many secrets. He shook once, coughing wetly into his hand, and his voice was rough when he spoke. I cannot write, Franco said. Tristan blinked at the absurdity of the statement. How could the man have come to be a master at Rev if he could not? Oh. Your contract, the thief said. I first encountered the bibliognost when I was a young man, out treasure hunting, Franco said. It was flattering when he took an interest in me. You will not have heard of him, I imagine, but he's a god that emerged with the first universities. A deity of scholars and secrets, dwelling in forgotten places of learning. Yet your contract is recent, Tristan stated. More than mere months old, by the thief's reckoning, but certainly not decades as contracting when a young man would have meant. I was proud in those days, headstrong, Franco said. I did not take his offer, for convinced I was meant for greater things still. And I was not entirely wrong. I was soon one of the youngest masters the University of Rev ever appointed. A pause. Only one day I looked around me and realized that I was 60 years old and I had not left a lasting mark on the world, Franco quietly said. That I would pass away and Vesper would forget my name. So you sought him out again, Tristan said. I did not go about it foolishly, Franco told him. I had precise ambitions. I had been close to finding records of the mythic first cant, the language from which all other holocants in the Trebian Sea are derived, but the ruins that should have led me to a library were defaced. I needed a way to plumb their secrets regardless. To hear the whispers in the stone, Tristan murmured. He gave you what you wanted. Time makes no difference to a god, Franco said. It had been decades to me, but to him barely the blink of an eye. The bibliognost offered me his power, and though the price for what I asked was steep, it was not unfair. He took your ability to write, the thief said. That was the price, Franco said, then he grimaced. Or so I thought. I had planned to get around the restriction by making a student write in my stead, which would have been eccentric but not so much that Rev would object. Only when I began to dictate my words to the student, she found she could not write them. He chuckled bitterly. Like trying to hold smoke, she described it, Franco said. And that was when I realized that I had not given away my ability to write, Tristan. I had given the bibliognost everything I might ever write. Oh, Tristan softly thought. A god of scholars and secrets, Franco had called the entity. Fortuna was the lady of long odds, the 1 in 1,000 chance, and it was such gambles she fed on, win or lose. The bibliognost had fed on the old professor's scholarship and through cunning phrasing also made everything Franco might learn through his contract secrets for him savor. If what Franco learned could not be writ down, in a matter of decades it would be good as forgot. Not all gods offered such plain bargains as the one had struck with Fortuna. Some saw their contractors as little more than the spoon filling their mouth. "Yes," Franco said. "I was tricked." "They sent you away from the university for it?" Tristan asked. A professor that could not write or be written for was hardly fit to teach students. "They were not going to throw me out," the old man snorted. "I was as familiar to my fellows as the bricks or the fountains, just as much a part of Ref. But I was to lose my master's chair and cease giving classes." He paused. "I could not stand it," Franco admitted. "Being tricked and losing so much, when I had thought myself cleverer than a god. So I turned to the Collegium, the library beneath Ref, and stole forbidden books so that I might find a way to break free of the price." "You said it was a disagreement with Rectoress that made you leave the university," Tristan recalled. Franco smiled toothlessly. "I got close," he said. "I could push it onto rabbits, but they never survived the process. I needed a larger brain, I knew, capable of higher thought, of true interaction with the other. And there are always students desperate for tutoring so their marks will not get them thrown out." Tristan went still. "You did it to a student." "They found the books in my room before I could," Franco said. He smiled mirthlessly. "Or so the rectoress told the infanzones, when she declared me a wanted man," he said. "In truth they were an hour late." The thief breathed in sharply. "It did not work," Franco conversationally said. "The boy's own brain bled him to death. So that was why the man was not some tutor ensconced in a noble house, teaching their children. He was a killer and a wanted man." Franco reached for another cabecita, broke it on his lip and sucked in the piece. He swallowed, wetly. "Are you disappointed, Tristan?" the old man lightly asked. "That I am not the kind of man I like to seem." Franco's face was unmarred by shame or doubt. He did not, the thief decided, regret what he had done. Even if it had failed. The old professor had decided that he was willing to kill for a chance at cheating the price of his contract, at gaining back all that he had lost. Maybe if Tristan were from the old town he would have been disgusted, but he was a rat. He knew better. Franco had been starved, so he had bit. That the boy he had bit had been underserving changed nothing. When had the world ever run on what people deserved? You bit what your teeth could reach, nothing more and nothing less. "I suppose I do have a question," Tristan said. "Oh," Franco said. "By all means, ask." The thief cocked his head to the side. "Did you find it?" he asked. "The first cant you were looking for?" Franco went still as stone, looking at him for a long time, then convulsed. Tristan thought him to be coughing or crying, until the bitterest laugh he had ever heard came crawling out. There was misspelling on the stele, Franco told him. It was supposed to be speaking of the library in a past tense, you see. The old man toothlessly smiled. It was torn down millennia ago to make room for a brothel, so there were nothing at all left to find. He laughed again, but Tristan could not help but hear the wail behind it. The whimper. He left the professor sitting alone, wrestling with his grief, and did not look back. He hid his own ghost to lay to rest and no time for anyone else's. The rope ladder up into the pillar wasn't guarded. Why would it be, when as far as Lieutenant Vicente knew the sole room there led to a door she had the only key to? Sloppy, the thief thought disapprovingly. In their place he would have left the watchman up there and had them pull the ladder up until morning. Vicente's imprudence was his gain as he snuck out of the old fort and climbed back up to the same room he had been so glad to be rid of earlier. In Tristan's pocket waited the stone button he had lent to Franco, but he did not use it yet. Instead he leaned back against the wall by the stone door and met Fortuna's golden eyes. She rolled them but went ahead anyway. The goddess could not stray far from him, but walls and locks meant nothing to her. She was not physically present, after all, only the illusion of her in his eyes. It was 20 seconds before she returned, popping her head through the still closed door. "He's not in there," Fortuna told him. I will need you to look ahead in the hallway as well, Tristan murmured. But remember, we cannot talk. He could be sensitive to sound. She cocked an eyebrow at him, a somewhat distressing sight when all he saw of her was a seemingly floating head and loose blonde locks. She was, he mused as his fingers closed against the stone button, definitely doing that on purpose. I am perfectly capable of silence, she said. It is your own incessant chatter that— He pressed the button into the opening, cutting her off by the act of the door popping open. He slid around it to catch the button as it fell out of the lock on the other side. Fortuna looked more than slightly offended, which only got worse when he put his finger to his lips in a smiling shush. The lights were back in the tile room, Tristan saw, but he did not linger there. Leaving the door ajar, he crept back up the way he had first come into this room, the maintenance door. The room there was exactly as he had left it, so the thief helped himself to the first reason he had returned. The last stone button went into his pocket, and then he took the brand Vicente was so hungry for. Now for the second reason. He doubled back towards the door with the broken latch, the one leading out into the hallway, and met Fortuna's eyes. She went through as he prepared to bolt, but returned with a shake of her head. The god was not there, at least for the moment. Why did it leave? Did God sleep? He had not thought so. Still, for now he would count his blessings and proceed down the hallway with all the quiet he had learned. The door was still there, hidden by the curve of the hall, and 24 steps took him to it. Green glass, but transparent enough he could see through it. And as he had thought when getting his first glimpse from a distance, what he saw through that door was a lift. Tristan fled after that, not slowing until the stone door closed behind him and he had a semblance of safety. Brand still in hand, stones in his pocket, the thief went to the edge of the room and finally allowed himself to rest. He sat at the edge, feet dangling in the void as the distant sight of the maze of ruins, from here little more than slices of antiquity bared by light, as if some ancient era had been left half-used on a cutting board, and his breathing evened out. Tristan the Brascal sat there in silence and thought, for now he saw the whole of the mosaic. Now all that was left was to decide where to slide the knife. Chapter 29. To her very great shame, Angharaide's first reaction was relief. It had not been one of hers. The second was fury. Ain's corpse could not have been left out of the hall by accident. The murderer had wanted them all to see it. She strode over to the crowd, only some of them turning at the sound. The rest were too busy shouting. Lord Ishan was the first to notice her, and the man, still chubby-cheeked, for all that the fresh scar across his lip now lent him a harder edge, turned red as an apple. Lady Angharade, he got out. Would you? I mean, Shalini leaned over his shoulder, glance flicking up and down, then let out an approving noise. He's asking you to put pants on, she translated. Respectfully. Angharade frowned. Her underclothes ended high on her thighs, but she was hardly naked. This is why people make sport of Ramayans, Nair, Tupac Sickle opined, stepping out. You can't take a gift even when it's dropped straight onto your lap. Tupac's gaze was hardly the most lascivious Angharade had ever been on the receiving end of. She had had worse leers stretching out in sparring clothes after getting sweaty, but the pale eyes were distinctly appreciative as they took her in. That and the attention the conversation was drawing from those who had been shouting was enough to convince Angharade to give in to Ishan's request. She could think of few things more nauseating than arguing about clothing besides a murder victim's corpse. Doubling back to her chambers, she dragged on pants and boots before hastily belting her saber. Grabbing her coat as well, she came out with outstretched arms only to pause right out the door. Young was there, bangs loose despite the haircut the kindly old lady had given him after he lost his top knot. So was Song, smiling, pressing a pistol against his belly. To the older Tiangxi's honor, he did not seem particularly fearful of that. Instead he nodded Angharade's way, ignoring he was but a twitch of the finger away from a shot in the guts. Tredegar, he said. A word in private, please. Angharade almost sighed, pulling her coat into place by tugging the lapels. That's not happening, Song said. I know who you are, Jiang Sheshao Yang. Some kind of Cathayan title. Yang hardly seemed a noble, and the republics should not have any besides. I do not recall seeing the young lady at Diekai, so I assure you she is quite safe, young Burley said. Angharai's eyes narrowed, irritated at being cut out a conversation that had begun with a request of her. That is enough, Song, she said, pushing down the muzzle of the pistol. I can decide for myself who I will speak to, in private or not. Her friend grimaced. Angharai, he is, whatever those words in Cathayan you appended to his name mean, I imagine, she cut in. I do not care. That does not place the decision in your hands. Diekai. The name was vaguely known to her. A battle a few decades back, perhaps a Republican victory? Angharai would admit to not having been the most dutiful of students when it came to the history of Tianxia and the Someshwar. There were only so many times you could hear of 10,000 soldiers dying to move a border by 2 miles before it all rather melded together. Her eyes moved to Yang. Meanwhile, Master Yang, we are largely unacquainted and there was recently a murder, she said. We will not be going anywhere alone. The three of us, however, can take a moment inside my chambers to have the conversation you requested. Song murmured something in Cathayan, the other Tianxi's eyes snapping to her as he replied acidly in the same, and Angharai's thinning patience snapped. You are both being intolerably rude, she coldly said. Mend your manners or leave. Song grimaced, nodding an apology, but Yang looked unmoved. Shall we go into your room? Angharai had half a mind to send him away, but that was anger speaking and not sense. She stepped back and invited them in, though she did not close the door. By the time both were inside, Song's pistol was nowhere to be seen. You wanted to speak to me, Angharai reminded the man. Here I am. Yang hesitated a moment, then made his decision. A friend of mine found out that Ains and Felis were both sent here by the same coterie, he said. It paid for their seats on the Blue Bell. The Perduri cocked an eyebrow. Coterie? Gang, Song clarified. Sacromonte has more than a dog his fleece. Some grow distressingly large and influential. The sign of a decaying state whose nobility improperly discharged their duties. Such a thing would never have been tolerated in Peredur. Souls committed to infamy did not stay in the duchy, they fled abroad to become pirates and hirelings. There would be time to consider the failings of Sacromonte later, however. Why would criminals pay to send a married couple onto this dangerous island? Angharai asked. For bets, Yang said. They are called red games. The desperate or indebted are sent here and told to accomplish a task in exchange for salvation. Oh, the noblewoman did not like the sound of that. The conclusion was obvious as it was ugly. Felis was told to kill his wife, she said, appalled. The Tianxi wiggled his hand. I do not know for sure, he said. But he tried to get her to leave our crew several times during the trial of Lines, and Ains told us that should she die before reaching the third trial there would be dire consequences. For whom? Angharai asked. They have children, I hear, Song quietly said. The older man nodded. The coteries, they do not care about the deaths, he said. Death is cheap. What they care about is the surprise, the story. If they told Ains she must live until the third trial or her children would die, then Felis might have been told the opposite, Angharai said. So they might find out who would turn on the other first. Her jaw clenched, teeth grinding. A disgusting abuse of power, fit only to be answered by the blade. You believe Felis did it, then, she said. I do not know, Yang admitted. But he had means, they slept in the same room, and motive. It looks much like Ju's murder, which I doubt he had anything to do with, but that might be the point. Song was more interested in something else. Why go to us with this? She asked. You came here with the Ramayan crew. The older Tianxi glanced at her with irritation, and for a moment Angharai thought they would start bickering again. Instead he shrugged. Han's a decent sort, for a Someshwari, but he will only go so far with this, Yang said. I do not believe you will drop the matter even if it becomes messy. It was true that Ains had not been part of Han's crew and so he had no obligation to her as a lord, but Angharai thought the young lord was being underestimated. She had no reason to believe the Someshwari so lacking in character as to allow a murder to go unpunished, but then Yang was Tianxi. he would have little understanding of nobility and its duties. Twice now one of us was murdered in cold blood, Angharad said. Heedless of messness, as you put it, we must rid ourselves of this curse before it strikes again. The Tiangsi gave her a nod, satisfied with the implicit premise. He had nothing more to tell them, so after barely passable levitating he took the door. Angharad would have followed, had Song not laid a restraining hand on her arm. There's something off about the body, she said. Ains, she no doubt meant. Angharad raised an eyebrow. How so? The throat was cut, but the spray of blood was minimal, Song said. Either the body was cleaned up or Ains was killed before her throat was cut, Angharad finished. She had made enough corpses to know the difference. That was not the case with the twins' death, she continued after a moment. There was a great deal of blood on the grass. Ju was definitely killed while alive, Song agreed. Which begs the question of why it was different this time, if it was the same killer's work. So Felis killed his wife without leaving a mark, then cut her throat to have the first murderer blamed for it, Angharad frowned. A pause. It could be the other way around, she pointed out. The killer could have made his death different to send us chasing after the wrong man. Though Angharad had never thought of such a thing being associated to murder before, stratagems of that kind were not uncommon at court. Song conceded with a nod. We won't learn anything more in here, anyhow, the Tiangsi said. Best to return before the others get impatient. They stepped right into a tinderbox. Around Ain's cooling corpse every soul in the temple had gathered, in varying degrees of dress but with every single soul armed. There were half a dozen pistols out and just as many blades, and though none were being pointed yet they were being waved about with too much enthusiasm for Angharad's taste. Lines were being drawn, groups coalescing. Lord Ishan, Shalini and Akanthi were pressing Tupac, by whom a sneering Okatlan stood. The object of the argument was Felis, who had hunched on himself looking like a beaten dog. They slept in the same bed, Ishan insisted. You would have me believe he did not wake up even as she was dragged out of the room. Drugs or a contract would see to that easily enough, Tupac shrugged. I am more interested in what Lan was doing, awake so early and walking about. The surviving Tiangsi twin looked nervous, but she was not alone. Lady Firanda, Brun and even Yang stood with her. It was Brun, the fair-haired Sacramontan even-tempered as ever, who replied. Are you suggesting she also murdered her own sister? Brun asked. Tupac shrugged, but there were few takers for the notion in the crowd. All remembered Lan's grief that morning. Besides, Brun continued, Lady Firanda was the first out the door after Lan shouted and she saw nothing worth calling attention to. One of us would have found the corpse eventually, Firanda Vilazar agreed. That it was Lan makes no difference. I cannot agree, Lord Raymond flatly said. I notice you were fully dressed, Firanda. Are you telling me you achieved this in mere moments before running out? It is most suspicious. Firanda's lips thinned. She did not answer. I am sure she has an explanation for that, Lady Isabel said, once again playing peacemaker. Let us not accuse in haste, Raymond. Master Cosm stood with the two in fan zones, closing off their faction. Unlike the two nobles, the mustachioed soldier looked unwilling to step into the argument, but he was armed and watchful. His eyes were seeking something, Angharad realized, or at least someone. A heartbeat later she realized whom. Where are Lord Zenzel and your Etsy? The noblewoman called out, stepping in with Song at her side. Ah, Lady Tredegar finally graces us with her presence, Tupac called out. A belated welcome to you. You talk a lot. For someone with so little to say, Shalini Gol mildly said. The same Someshwari then glanced Angharad's way. Both of them rushed in when everyone was there, Shalini said, but they must have slipped away after. Murmurs spread. Suspicious, Raymond said. Can it even be called an echo if you only repeat your own voice, Cherton? Yang mocked. There were more laughs than she would have expected to that, and several who smiled. Raymond's cheeks reddened with anger, but Cosm kept him from answering as he clearly wished to. Enough, Angharad stepped in. We cannot get to the bottom of this until everyone is here. Did anyone see which way they went? A lot of muttering, But no answer. Then we will have to look for them level by level, Angharad said. Moving in pairs for safety. That won't be necessary. She recognized Lord Zenzel's voice even before the man himself came into view, a steel-faced Yurtsi at his side. They were coming down the stairs that led to the upper level, and Angharad's stomach clenched. Neither looked as if they were bearing good news. We went to have a look at the gates upstairs, Yurtsi explained. The reigning current of curiosity ensured they were allowed to speak instead of questioned. Someone took a hammer to 2 of the 3, Lord Zenzel told everyone. Their needles no longer turn and the mechanisms are damaged. I expect only the gate slated for the 7th hour will be fit to open. We are being forced to stick together, Angharad thought. Why? Should the murdered not prefer for the crews to split off again as quickly as possible, to hide from retribution? I know of only one hammer around here, Song noted. Okatlan? The big man snorted. Like any of you twigs could swing it, the Aztlan said. It was in my rooms when the racket woke me up, so it hasn't been stolen. Then we ought to look through everyone's bags for a hammer, Lord Ishan suggested. Agreed, Angharad forcefully said. Some hesitation from the crowd, but willingness as well. No one wanted the murderer to walk free. A bloodied knife was planted in my valet's affairs, last time, Lord Remond cautioned them. Let us not assume a hammer means culpability, it could have been placed there. Sounds like something a man with a hammer in his bag might say, Tupac grinned. That saw an end to all argument from a freshly red-cheeked Remond. It was longer and more arduous to arrange who would look through the bags than look through them. In the end 3 of them, Angharad, Ishan, Tupac, were deputized to act. The 2 captains of the crew the bag's owner were not part of did the looking, with some effort made as to discretion. As much as they could while doing this in the hallway with everyone looking, anyhow. A quick but methodical search that could not have lasted more than 10 minutes revealed no hammer. It could be hidden in the killer's room, Brun suggested. We can search those as well. I would have been simpler to just throw it in one of the pools downstairs when they were done, a cane thief opined. And I don't think anyone wants to go looking through that strange water. There were grimaces at that, but no one contradicted her. All had been careful not to come into direct contact with the iridescent waters in the pools and waterfalls below. Then we must look for the murderer with wits and witnesses, Angharad said. Question all those who might have seen something. This is not Malin, Lady Angharad, and we are not your peasants, Shalini Gol bluntly said. No one here is bound to abide by your judgment. Afraid of questions, Someshwari? Lord Remond sneered. Lady Angharad has proved honorable, unlike you lot. She eased her surprise at the unstinting defense, though part of her did wonder if it was merely a springboard to strike at his opponents from. Her honor is not in question, Lord Ishan mildly replied. It seems wiser, however, for more than one person to investigate this affair. Lord Ishan is entirely correct, she said. I did not mean to imply otherwise. Angharad had expected relatively straightforward acclamations, as for the bags, but to her surprise it was not the case. Few supported Tupac, only Okatlan and Felis, while Ishan similarly struggled to earn support from his crew. Brown and Lady Firanda instead pushed for Young, surprisingly supported by Lan. The sudden sundering of authority made no sense to her, until the argument led her to watching Zenzel as he argued for himself as an investigator. The gate, it was all because of the gate. There was only one to take, so like it or not everyone would be going the same way and sharing the same path. The previous captaincies were meaningless because everyone would tread the same ground anyway, so now everyone pressed for those they liked or trusted the most instead of their once captain. Is that what the murderer wanted? Forcing everyone to go through a single gate, one that was to open within hours, had resulted in the effective end of the delving cruise. Worse, we all know there is only so long left until the 7th hour, she thought. When the gate did open at that time, they would have to take it whether the murderer was found or not. They would, otherwise, be stuck in this temple with the killer for another night or day. It was devil's cleverness at work, but cleverness nonetheless, and it gave them trouble. Angharade was acclaimed into an investigator's role by 6 voices within moments of it becoming, then young by maintaining his 4, and then to her surprise Tupac won over Lord Ishan when your Etsy spoke for him over the other man. To have neither your Etsy nor Zenzel's voice as part of her count when she did have a cane thief was something that left her rather unsettled. Song leaned in close. They both voted late, after you were guaranteed to have be one of the victors, Song reassured her. The point was to pick more than one candidate, not express distrust in you. Angharade did not know what she liked less about this, that the pair had not truly sent support where they thought it most deserving, or that Song thought this to be some kind of democratic process. Worse was that she was not entirely sure the Silverite Tianxia was wrong. Setting aside her discomfort, she held counsel with Young and Tupac. The 3 agreed that everyone should return to their rooms until the questioning was finished and that though there was a right to question, violence was strictly forbidden, despite Tupac's protests. You would have us dig a pit without shovel, the Aztlan complained. I will not entrust you with authority I believe you will abuse, Angharade frustily. I just think you're the worst kind of prick, Young confessed. But sure, what she said. Tupac laughed. She decided to believe that Young was being facetious, for both their sakes. Angharade's first act was to ask the other 2 if they had any questions for Song and, when told this was not the case, claiming her as a right hand for the rest of the investigation and fetching her from her room. Tupac followed suit with Okatlan, but Young preferred going at it alone. Having no intention to stay together for the interrogations, they split up and go to work after together laying Ains to rest on the stone bed in one of the empty rooms. Within moments Angharade stood alone with her Tianxi friend, breathing in deeply. Lan was the first to see the corpse, Song said. She seems the logical place to start. The noblewoman saw no reason to disagree. They were the first to go to the twin, who was waiting calmly in her room. Lady Angharade, Song ran, Lan said, nodding a greeting. I'd wondered if it would be you or Tupac first. The Perdiri nodded a greeting back but kept the courtesies brief. You found the body, Angharade said. Tell me about it. It was dead, Landarli replied. The Perdiri twitched at the flippancy. Was it cold? Song asked. The other woman shrugged. I did not touch it, she said, so I cannot say. What were you doing out in the first place? Song asked. I was going to take a piss, Lan frankly said. Almost did anyway, stumbling onto Ains like that. Angharade's eyes narrowed. The crudity of the answer was distasteful, but it was too distasteful. It felt like the girl she had dueled last year at Maui Peak who had kept striking at her face. Angharade's form had been better, they both knew, so her opponent had tried to make her lose her temper to bring them back on even ground. You are, Angharade coldly said, lying. Song idly produced her pistol, which Lan's eyes followed warily. Though Angharade almost told her to put it away, the implication of violence was not strictly against the promise made, only the actual exercise. That's a bluff, the twin snorted. No way you agreed on giving each other that authority. We voted on it, Angharade stiffly said. She felt the blue-lipped woman's eyes on her as she spoke, Lan eventually letting out a small curse in Antigua. She bit her lip, then raised her hands. Fine, she said. You got me. I wasn't coming out of my room at all, because I never went into it. Angharade blinked, taken aback. Why? Song breathed in. You spent the entire night spying on everyone's movements, the Tianxi said. To see who went where. Lan grinned, unrepentant. It's always useful to know who's fucking and scheming with who, the blue-lipped woman said. And it's not like I was doing anything forbidden, is it? I just waited in a dark corner with a good view and waited, that's not even snooping the way most people would see it. Wait, if she had been keeping an eye on everyone's coming and goings then. Angharade coughed into her fist, embarrassed. Yeah, my lady, your cheeks should be red, Lan cackled. That girl's good as engaged, the way Remen Cherden tells it. Angharade? The noblewoman found Song's silver eyes on her, face unreadable. It was not, she tried, then swallowed. We didn't. I declined, given the circumstances. But she attempted to sleep with you, Song slowly said. "We are straying off the subject," Angharade stiffly replied. The Tianxi must have taken it as a confirmation, for her face tightened. For a moment Angharade thought she saw anger in the cast of the other woman's face, but surely that was only the light. She had never been given the slightest hint that Song might be interested in her or that they thought of each other in such a light, so what call was there for jealous anger? Salvation came from an unexpected source. Poor Isabel, Lan mused. She must have been wanting a pick-me-up after her other visit. That got both their attentions. Other visit? Angharade asked. Raymond Cherton came to her room, the blue-lipped woman said. Stayed in there about a quarter hour, left looking angry and went straight back to his own. Song hummed, looking interested. Trouble in Sacramonte, perhaps, she said. Who else wondered, Lan? Ah, and now you even call me by my name all sweetly, the other woman smiled. Funny how even a rat gets a smile when they have the right dirt, it's almost as if the world runs on secrets. It may help us find out who the killer was to know who moved around during the night, Angharade honestly told her. I would ask that you tell us. The twin sighed. Fine, she dismissed. Shalini went to Lord Ishan's room, and I didn't need my ear against the door to guess why. Stayed for about 2 hours, then back to her own. Just a little after that, Fernanda Vilazar came out of her own fully dressed and went upstairs. Angharade stilled. They were all on the 4th level, and the 5th held little save the room with the gates. Did she have a hammer? She asked. She wore a cloak so I can't say, Lan told them. She was gone for an hour at most, then back to her room. Angharade worried her lip. And after that? Song asked. After that I fell asleep, Lan admitted. When I woke up I wasn't sure about the time, so I headed to my room to grab some sleep. I ran into Ains' corpse on the way and you know what follows. She closed her eyes, trying to fit the pieces. How long Lady Isabel stay in my quarters? She asked. Go there around the 11th hour, left around the 1st, Lan said. Shalini's visit? From midnight to the 2nd hour, more or less, she replied. After which Lady Ferrand had gone upstairs for an hour then come back down. It's 5:15 at the moment, Song noted. And it should not have been much more than half an hour since this all began. So Lan found the body a quarter before the 5th hour, more or less, and before that there were a little under 2 hours through which the twin had slept. The last person known to have stalked the halls was, it appeared, Lady Ferranda. That made it plain who Angharade's next visit needed to be. Thank you for your help, she told Lan. The Tianxi grinned, revealing teeth stained just as blue as her lips. If you catch them, try not to kill them, Lan said. I have a debt to settle first. Angharade not often spoken with Lady Ferranda Vilazar since the trial of ruins had begun, something she occasionally felt a sliver of guilt over. Now was not the time to indulge in that guilt, however, so when she and Song entered the room she kept her face blank. Ferranda, still fully dressed and her bun pulled tight, sat on her bed. The greetings exchanged were stiff, so Angharade decided not to stretch out the shared discomfort. You were seen going upstairs during the night, she told the Infanzona. May I know why? The fair-haired Sacramontan studied her a moment, frowning. Lan or Brun, she finally said. Everyone else would have thought it beneath them to spy. Brun was not much of a snoop, Angharade thought, so therefore Andy must read the situation. Either way, she had no intention of revealing Lan's tactlessness, for another to be indiscreet was no excuse to follow their example. Interesting insight, Song said. Not, however, an answer to our question. Ferranda sighed. I went upstairs, she said, so I could take a hammer to 2 of the 3 paths. There was a short, awkward pause as Angharade admitted to herself she had not expected so blunt and easy a confession. Song seemed similarly taken aback. To what purpose? She finally asked. Ferranda straightened. I am told that Lady Isabel passed a trial as part of your crew while displaying obvious foreknowledge. And you have foreknowledge of your own, Angharade said, unwilling to leave it unsaid. Not our own, the Infanzona admitted. House Vilazar bought it from a house better informed. Among that knowledge was a thorough description of this very temple and of where the 3 gates lead. It is one of the few fixed points in the maze. And what makes the gate so important? Angharad asked. One of those I broke leads into a trap, a hallway whose floor rises to meet the ceiling, Firanda said, and the P30 winced. The second leads back to another crossroads, spreading in every direction. She paused. The one I spared should lead to a temple fortress overlooking the very last stretch of the maze, a passage called the Toll Road. Song stirred from her place leaning against the wall, earning a curious look from the other 2. I have heard the name before, she said. I was told it leads directly to the gate where the 10 victors must stand. You could have shared your knowledge with others instead of wielding a hammer, Angharad said, turning to the other noble, though the reproach in her voice was mild. Knowing that Firanda had not acted with the intent to harm rather robbed her of any genuine offense at the act. I did, Lady Firanda said. Lord Ishan then requested I keep the information secret. Angharad's jaw tightened. The gate to the death trap, she began, who, Tupac's group, the Infanzona cut in. And while I do not disagree the man deserves to die, he would not have died alone. And so Firanda Velazar had acted within the bounds of honor. She had not gone against the word of the captain she had gone under, but neither had she allowed those she deemed unworthy of death to approach it unknowing. Angharad nodded in respect, which had Firanda's plain face twisting in surprise. Song cleared her throat. I mean no slight to your honor, the Tianxi said, but should we want to verify your words? I do not image Lord Ishan will deny them if asked, the Infanzona shrugged. The hammer you used? Song pressed again. I tossed at one of the pools downstairs, Firanda musedly said. Much as Lady Akanthi guessed. It is the one besides the twisted gargoyle with dragon's claws, if you are inclined to look. Angharad cleared her throat. And the reason why you remained dressed? In case this all went bad, Lady Firanda frankly said. Should my actions be found out while I slept, I did not want to be caught in my underclothes, and so I slept fully dressed. My affairs are also all packed. A look behind them was enough to bear that out. The room was pristine, the bags orderly. Song, though, was not yet satisfied. Why destroy 2 of the gates? She asked. Only one was truly harmful. Because I want this godforsaken trial to end, Tianxi, the Infanzona harshly said. Once we have all found the Toll Road it will only be a matter of days until this all over. Then, enough, Angharad said, cutting off Song. She inclined her head at Lady Firanda. Thank you for your answers. Think nothing of it, the Infanzona dismissed. Her Tianxi right hand did not need to be dragged out of the room, saving them both the embarrassment. Angharad turned on her after the door closed behind them. That was unnecessary, she flatly said. Song shook her head. She was lying. A pause. You believe she is the murderer? Angharad tried. No, Song admitted. But she was lying about why she sabotaged 2 of the gates instead of 1, I am sure of it. She is hiding something. The P30 grit her teeth in frustration, at both the insistence that Song should have been allowed to continue her rudeness and that perhaps the insistence was not entirely unwarranted. We are all hiding things, Song, she finally said. Maybe, the Tianxi said, unconvinced. But mark my words, Angharad, there were games afoot tonight, and the one that made a corpse might not even have been the most dangerous. Their third destination must, inevitably, be Felis. Though Angharad was uncertain of his guilt, Young's words could not be denied. The man had had both motive and opportunity. Only when the pair reached his room there was already someone standing by them. Tupac stood by the open door, smiling as they arrived. Beyond the threshold O'Cutlan seemed to be speaking with Felis. We require a word with him, Angharad told him. Oh, he drawled. What for? Already the man was trying her patience. Deciding on boldness, Angharad went for the throat. We have reason to believe he was bribed to kill his wife, she said. A moment passed. For a man whose follower had just been implicitly accused of murder, Tupac Sickle seemed most unshaken. You are correct, Tupac easily said. Felis was told that if he slew his wife before the third trial, Their children would be raised wealthy. Angharad paused, taken aback again. Villains in plays were much harder to unmask. The Eastleigh then raised a finger. The condition, however, was that he must do it with his own hands. Tupac continued. Look at him now, Tredegar. Angharad did. Worn and bruised, Felis looked hunched on himself even though O'Cutlan was looking unusually mild. He also kept glancing at the corners of the room, gnawing at his lips. Guilt? No, mostly he looked worried. Not even all that afraid, but anxious about something past the horizon. Does he look like someone who just got his way? Tupac asked. The Perduri's lips thinned. No, she admitted nonetheless. He'll be scheming to see if he can claim he did a deed to his patrons anyhow, the pale-eyed Aslan said. But the man is scavenger, nothing more. He does not have the spine or competence to have done this, much less the first murder. Song cleared her throat. And this tale you told us of what the coterie demanded of him, she said. How do you know it? I had O'Cutlan hang him upside down while I asked questions, Tupac said. Angharad looked at him aghast. The man put a hand over his heart, a beaming smile on his face. Come now, I am no monster, Tupac said. I did wait until his wife was out of the room, Lady Angharad. He'd still had a fair shot at murdering her down the line. Her jaw clenched, fingers tightened around the grip of her blade. His spear was not yet assembled. It was a dishonor to strike the unarmed, but if she could find a reason. We will not fall for your provocations, Song evenly said. You can cease trying. Angharad, who had about to fall for the provocations, mastered herself with some effort. Now was not the time or place for Tupac to learn that crime honoringly earned punishment. Felis is not so much a suspect as first believed, she said through gritted teeth. We are in agreement, then, Tupac said. I am impressed with this killer, truth be told. This is subtler than when they framed Tristan for the twin. They had to learn about the Red Games, not simply observe a brawl. Angharad paused. You did not believe Tristan to be the killer, she slowly said. Of course not, Tupac said. He seemed surprised at the words. You accused him repeatedly, Tickle. Led the charge to see him blamed. Because I wanted him to die, the Aslan told her, as if she were a little slow. Angharad's saber made it halfway out of the scabbard before Song caught her wrist. Not here, she said. Not now. And Tupac was grinning. Already he was reaching for his segmented spear, putting the first two parts together. Why? Angharad demanded. What possible reason could you have had to try to get an innocent man killed? Something about him offends my god, Tupac shrugged. I am told he feels like someone who should have died 100 times over, that it is most disorderly. Song forced the sword back in the scabbard and Angharad let her. They were still under truce, she reminded herself. However thin a truce it might be. I require words with Felis, she coldly said. Immediately. So demanding, Tupac said, fanning himself. But he did call for O'Cutlan, who rose to his feet. The big man with the broken nose tried to brush into her as he passed, but Angharad squared her feet, her shoulder bone dug in the soft of his own shoulder, the Aslan drawing away with a pained growl. Angharad stared him down until he looked away, leaving with a still smiling Tupac. Ishan might have had a point, Song murmured. A jest, no doubt, but not one she was in a mood to humor. She did not answer, striding in instead, and before she could so much as offer a greeting Felis began to babble. I didn't do it, he swore. I was still sleeping when all the shouting began, just Aslan, and, tell us of your evening before, Song cut in. The longer they spoke with the man, the clearer it became he had little to say. He had gone to sleep early and woken up only when Lan found his wife's body. They had shared a room but not a bedroll, and Angharad could help but find that for someone with so little to relay the man seemed all too nervous. May I have a look at your wound? She suddenly asked. Felis stilled. Why? Discomfort, Angharad thought. One of the secrets being kept. It will be easier to ascertain if you could have killed your wife at all given the state of your wound, Song smoothly replied. Felis unbegrudgingly agreed. opening his shirt and tugging down mostly clean bandages to show where Raymond had stabbed him in the belly. Angharade knelt, frowning as she saw the wound was mostly closed. No, not closed. The red of the gash was not that of healed flesh but of something else, blood red, sanguine, but not blood. Carefully touching around the wound with the tip of her fingers as Phyllis hissed in exaggerated pain, she found that the flesh was stiff. Solid, almost like as if there were bone beneath it. Frowning, Angharade drew away and back to her feet. "See?" Phyllis said. "I couldn't have done it." A lie. Whatever that blood-red material was, it had effectively closed the wound. The noblewoman expected skin would grow back over it in time, leaving only that patch of solid skin. "We are finished here," Angharade finally said. "Agreed," Sung said. And the other woman's tone was as grim as her own thoughts, for they had grasped the very same problem. For all they had learned, they still had no real idea who'd murdered Ains. Young was waiting in the hall when she emerged, looking in no better mood than she. "How is the wound?" the Tianxi asked. "Good as healed," Angharade replied. The Tianxi sighed, passing a hand through his freshly cut bangs. "Dead ends for me," Yang said. "I heard about the nightly visits from Lan, but Raymond Cherden insists he only went over to speak of his upcoming engagement and Ruesta agreed." Angharade readied herself for embarrassing questions, but none came. Was he not going to ask about Isabel's visit to her own rooms? "Did you get anything out, Lady Feranda?" Sung asked, filling the silence before it could grow too noticeable. That she was saving poor lambs, benevolent mistress that she is, Young Burley said. Vilazar was done with our crew and decided her way out was forcing us all down the same path, I'm guessing. An uncharitable interpretation, but Angharade supposed Feranda could have been moved to act for more than one reason. A span of 2 hours with no witness is too long, Sung noted. There is no solid way to catch out the culprit with such a glaring hole in our knowledge. My thoughts exactly, Yang said. Any idea why Xickle went straight for Phyllis from the start? If anyone should know everything the man has to say, it's him. Angharade paused. He has sought out no one save Phyllis for questioning? She asked. Lan, but only moments and after me, Yang replied. That seemed odd. As did the fact that he did not seem to be interrogating anyone currently. What was the Eastleigh after? Angharade let Sung inform the other Tianxi that they had no idea what Tupac had asked about and looked for the man herself, finding that he was not anywhere on the 4th level. She learned where he had been when she caught him coming down the stairs. What were you doing? She asked. Looking if the gates were truly broken, as our friend Zenzel said, Tupac said. You can never be too safe, yes? You were lying, Angharade thought, looking at his easy smile. We missed something and you found it. The purpose of this arrangement was to share information, she evenly said. Not hoard it. That you think that, he gently told her, is why you'll lose. Her jaw clenched. Perhaps I should put an end to this contest, then, Angharade said, fingers gripping the handle of her saber. If you do not respect the spirit of the truce, why should you protect it by it? Tupac grinned. Come now, Raymond only stayed in your lovely lady's quarters for a bit, he said. Not enough for you to get jealous over, surely? Angharade stilled. That he would taunt her over that and not Isabel's visit to her rooms was. Lan had told no one else about Isabel's visit, she realized. Gratitude, however guilty, seized her soul. It changed her mood enough that she took her hand off her blade, to Tupac's visible disappointment. A man can only take so much teasing, Tredegar, he gravely reproached. We are still under truce, Angharade replied. And why should I value even the shallows of my honor more than the likes of your life? Well, Tupac Xickle mused, if you were going to sweet-talk me so, I suppose I shall have to forgive you. One day, Angharade thought, he would push her and there would be no strictures of honor protecting him. She was going to savor that day. The second council between the three of them was largely ceremony, none of them had found the killer or even a solid lead. Tupac was sitting on secrets, and likely so were she and Young, but with silence holding there was resolution to be had. They sent for everyone to come out for a common address, the 7th hour having crawled dangerously close. The revelation that no culprit had been found did not go over well, not that Angharad had expected failure to be met with applause. Even less popular was the acknowledgement that there was now only one way forward, through the gate that would open in under an hour. But what other choice was there? When the 7th hour came, all 17 took the gate, eyes on each other as much as the dangers that lay ahead. Chapter 30. On the other side of the gate waited not a test but a tunnel. Narrow and damp, it led them up for 15 minutes, occasionally at so strong an upwards tilt that some of them slid on the smooth stone and tumbled back into others. It was a relief when they emerged into open grounds, entering some sort of strange water garden. It looked like a large pond with islands of stone tracing a path across, but the waters turned out to be fathomlessly deep. And the path itself was occasionally chancy path, as they soon realized that the islands were in fact the top of pillars reaching up from the deeps, and that some had been eaten away at by the water. When one toppled, Lady Acanthe fell into the water, beginning to sink almost immediately. Had Master Cosme and Cellini not dragged her out, she might well have drowned. More worrying still was what that Acanthe foes assured them she was a skilled swimmer, only the water had been unnaturally heavy. She'd compared it to trying to swim through molasses. They were all glad to be rid of the place, all the more when the last island brought them to a dilapidated First Empire highway that, aside from the occasional loose stone, presented no danger at all. 2 opportunities to take a left off the highway led straight into dead ends, one of them a strange black stone shrine whose closed door was thankfully received, and after a second hour's worth of walking they reached the top of plunging stairs. The end of the highway was broad enough for nearly all of them to have a look at the distant silhouette of the temple fortress, which almost into silence. Some of them, anyway. "I don't care what the Blascloaks claim, that is not a temple," Zenzel Duma announced. "Fly a flag on it and all that's missing is easily footpads to shoot at." "I'll rustle up a flag if you can get Xicle to stand still," Lady Ferranda offered. Angharad was not amused, because it would have been beneath one of her breeding to snort at such lowbrow humor. She had merely been clearing her throat. Truly, however, Zenzel had a point. Ferranda had described their destination as a temple fortress, but what Angharad beheld leaned distinctly towards the latter word. Stairs so roughly carved they were barely noticeable went down an abrupt slope for at least a few hundred feet until they reached the bottom of a cauldron. Or so it seemed, for on all sides hundreds of shattered shrines stacked onto one another formed incomprehensible. It was a cacophony of broken faiths, a wall whose every brick was the ghost of some ancient promise. It troubled Angharad, looking at it too long. The sheer amount of shrines reaching up to the sky, a tombstone of silenced laments drenched in the golden light of the firmament above. This was a graveyard of spirits, and its utter silence was more menacing than any chorus of wails. Rising from the center of the cauldron's bottom rose the promised temple fortress. It was not in the shape of the modern fortresses, stars and angles and bastions, or even of older keeps with towers and tall curtains walls. Instead it was a thing of tiers, full red walls shaped like circles interlocking like a haphazard pile of plates balancing one way and the other. There were 8 levels and almost twice as many circles of varying size, the broadest and highest at the bottom and narrowing as they rose. At the summit of the very highest tier a small tower and the same red stone stood, leading to a narrow stone bridge that connected to the top of the surrounding cliffs. The way forward, presumably to the toll road that Ferranda had claimed, was the very last stretch of the maze. "I've seen that kind of stone before," Cellini shared. "My family comes from south of Mahapara, and the cities on the shore of the Arama River use it for everything." Angharad knew at least one of those names. Mahapara was one of the great powers inside the imperial Someshwar, the Rajas usually wrestling with those of Varveda and lesser rivals for who was to claim the Maharaja's scepter, and with it the authority to rule over all of the imperial Someshwar, at least in name. Someshwari were a famously fractious lot. "I thought you were a Mayan," Yang said. "I am," she assured him. "The Golar merchants. When we expanded into Ramaya, a branch of the family settled accordingly. I was born there myself." Ah, Angharad thought. The nature of the ties between Lord Ishan's house and the common Brangol was at last made clear. The merchants must have sought the help and protection of local nobles when settling there, as was only proper. Even more proper was such ties resulting in the Gaul providing a fosterling and attendant to someone of the near line, tightening the bonds between nobles and a wealthy subject. It was important, father had always told her, to remain on good terms with the wealthy living on your lands. Fascinating, Lord Raymond cut in, his tone indicating he thought it anything but. If we might perhaps attend to the fortress before us. It is useful information, Brun mildly replied. It means the god within might be of the Someshware. I do not recall asking for your, Raymond began, so Angharad stepped in. Clearing her throat, she raised her voice over his. We should get moving, the noblewoman said. The stairs seem dangerous, so we will have to be careful going down. They'd had enough of arrest gawking, so her suggestion was taken without argument. No one wanted to spend too long out here when there was still a murderer hiding among them, much less be stuck spending a night out. Lord Zenzel took the lead, Lady Ferranda volunteering to go behind him. The pair had stood together on the same unstable pillar earlier, narrowly keeping it from toppling by shifting their weight, and taken to each other since. Angharad hardly thought their griefs were the same. Zenzel had lost his lover and his aunt, while Ferranda only a close retainer, but that grief was shared could not be denied. Friendships had been made of less. She herself followed behind Ferranda, Lord Ishan in turn claiming the space behind her. What a noble vanguard we have, young Burley said. There were some laughs, so Angharad was somewhat relieved when your Etsy volunteered to be next before Shalini could step in. She had not noticed earlier, but it was true that the nobleborn among them tended to take the lead. The captaincies had come at an end, however, and now an unthinking assumption of leadership was not without risks. There was hardly a trace left of the old crews in how the group held themselves. Relying on such a structure would be a mistake. However difficult the stairs looked, they were significantly worse in practice. Not only were they narrow, too much to fit her entire boot on, they were short, many and winding. Angharad had to be careful with every step, never lapsing in attention, and the absence of anything like a railing was discomforting. If someone fell, there was absolutely nothing to hold them back. At least half a mile of such labor, surrounded by the creeping cliff sides, would be exhausting work. By unspoken agreement they began taking breaks regularly, spread out across different sections of the stairs, and one such pause was when Lord Ishan approached her. It occurs to me, the chubby-cheeked man said, that we have had little occasion to talk since Ane's body was discovered. The angle he stood at hid his scar, bringing back a shadow of the soft look he'd had when the trials began. Angharad considered him. Learning from Lady Ferranda that he had planned to send 5 of them into what was quite possibly their death, not only Tupac and O'Cotlan but also the underserving, Lan and Ains and Phyllis, had not endeared him to her. Nor had that she had been headed for a deeper part of the maze instead of the end, and the man had not meant to inform her as much. No, that last part was unfair. She was merely assuming he might have planned otherwise. But it had not gone unnoticed by Angharad that few people who joined Lord Ishan and Shalini's crew ever seemed to want to stay there. We have not, she acknowledged. Events dictated otherwise. Elections do tend to be rowdy business, he smiled. The way it tugged at his cheeks revealed a hint of the scar, like a face peeking out from beneath a mask. Have you given any thought to the third trial? He continued. She hid her surprise. The trial of weeds? I must confess to my attention has remained on our present tribulations. It might be wise to begin thinking ahead, Lord Ishan advised her. Many who are now your allies will depart once they reach Sanctuary, returning to Sacramonte. That is true, she cautiously agreed, but as I know little of the nature of the third trial I cannot say if it will be a disadvantage. Besides, Song intended to become part of the watch, and the same was true of Barun. Without the Infanzones at her side there should be nothing preventing the 3 of them from making common cause for the trial of weeds. It was Lord Ishan, on the contrary, who looked exposed to her eye. Who still stood by him, save for Shalini. It is rarely an advantage to be alone, Ishan said, then shrugged. I would not urge to you an early decision, but keep in mind that Shalini and I would be glad to have you with us when the time comes." A polite non-answer was already on the tip of her tongue, but Angharad stopped herself. She had a real look at the other noble instead, at the worn stance and the sleepless lines that could be seen even on the half of his face he showed. Ishan Nair did not look so sinister to her, in that moment, just a man who was tired and feeling the edge of the pit creeping ever closer. "You have to know it has a bad look," she quietly said. "They do not talk ill of you, Lord Ishan, but they do leave." He sighed, passing a hand through his hair. "I know," Ishan said. "It is." The Someshwari hesitated. "I suppose you will learn eventually," Ishan finally said. "Unspoken rules only go so far. Shalini's contract has drawbacks." Angharad could not reveal she had once glimpsed the gunslinger putting 2 shots in Tupak's eye faster than the blink of an eye without revealing details of her own contract, but Shalini's supernatural skill with pistols was no secret. "They are not visible," she admitted. "They would not be, where you've seen her use it," Ishan said. "But out here it is another story. I shall avoid details, but it might be said that when she uses the contract it sometimes draws attention." She paused, the implications of that word sinking in. "Spirits. Gods, Lars, lemures," he agreed. "Maybe even those who use signs. Out here in the maze, it has mostly drawn the eye of remnants, the echoes of dead gods. You should have encountered a few. Only one, but that had been memorable enough. Your Etsy would have fallen off the ledge had Angharad not caught her by the collar when the screeching thing appeared. Refraining from using the contract would put an end to the risks, she carefully said. One must always tread lightly when speaking of contracts. Ishan grimaced, his expression resigned, as if expecting scorn. "It would be the wise choice, if she could make it," he said. "There is a reason we chose to seek out the watch, Lady Angharad. Both our contracts would benefit from the lessons they have to teach. She cannot control when she uses the contract," Angharad realized. Or not always, which was near as damning. So every time Shalini used her contract it sent up a flare for any creature looming, and she could not promise she would cease sending them up. Sleeping God, no wonder their crew kept bleeding people. Especially here in the maze, where the cause and effect would be even more obvious than during the trial of lines. Neither were being outright malicious, Angharad thought, but it was no wonder that so few had supported Lord Ishan during the earlier debates. It might not have been out of malice, but he had still put their lives at risk. Yet what else was he to do, abandon the childhood friend he had come here with? The colder part of her, the one her father had taught, whispered that he might well have been sending Tupak's entire crew to their deaths simply so there would be fewer options besides staying with his own. Had everyone gathered back at the old fort tonight and Angharad learned that Ishan's gate led to the end of the maze, she would almost certainly have negotiated for their crews to ally and return together. And in a way, she thought, the Someshwari had gotten what he wanted. They were all going forward as a single crew. Yet he had not gotten what he needed. Ishan had no authority here, and if Shalini's contract began causing trouble the pair were certain to be cast out. Perhaps even violently. All because there was only a single gate that could be used, so any claim he might have had to it being his was little more than wind. "You might have made steadier allies had you revealed it from the start," she said. "We would have had no allies at all," he replied, shaking his head. "Better to have them for a time than never." Much as she disliked the approach, she was not certain he was wrong. And he had not lied, she would give him that. It did not make up for his condemning 5 trial-takers to die. As if sensing her disapproval, he turned fully, light caught the scarred side of his face as it faced her at last, coloring half as if it were a different one entirely. "There is more to say," he told her. "But perhaps this is not the time and place." "Perhaps not," Angharad replied, inclining her head. They left it at that, resuming their way down the stairs. Only it could not have been more than a minute or two before she caught a flicker of movement behind her. She had been betrayed, Angharad thought. He was to be rid of her as he had wanted with Tupak, suffering no other former captain and And then she realized that Ice Han was not attacking her but falling on her. Shouting, he tumbled forward and in a snap decision Angharade glimpsed ahead. The man on her back, the two of them rolling down, sifting through Firanda's legs from behind as she fell off the stairs and screamed. As a girl, Angharade had once spent 6 months taught by a grim-faced and tattooed man from Uthugil who had claimed to be the Prince of Black Hill. His lessons had all been about what he had called the Gale game. The Low Isle was under constant siege by storms, he had told her, sea and wind carving ever deeper grooves into its bluffs and canyons. From those constant companions the people of the Low Isle had learned lessons. Mother's take on the teaching had been simpler. He is here to teach you how to fall, she'd said. Into the calm, Angharade thought, bending forward as Ice Han hit her back. The worst mistake you could make was to fight the Gale. The Gale always won. Chin tucked, arms up, and Angharade embraced the fall, enough that even as Ice Han hit the stairs she kept falling forward. There was shouting but she ignored it, turning with the fall and making a roll out of it. Stone bit at her back for the merest heartbeat, but she twisted forward and finished the tumble. Her boots hit the stone, paint tingling up her legs, and for half a dozen feet she skidded down the narrow stairs with gritted teeth. Her left leg came forward a bit but not before she slowed, her momentum slowly grinding to a halt until she was left half-crouched and now far past both Firanda and Zenzel, who had gotten out of the way without her even noticing. Panting, Angharade rose to her full height and brushed off her shoulders. I fall, I stand, she told the wind, as her teacher had taught her. Try again if you dare. She did not speak Matabele, for all that the Uthugil dialect had the same root as Amoya, so she was not entirely sure that was truly what the words meant. Prince had been a profligate liar, and the only time she had told father the words he had choked and instructed her never to repeat them in front of guests. Yet there was something satisfying about speaking the words, she thought. Almost like a victory prayer. That sliver of satisfaction was short-lived, however, as shouting from above forced her to turn that way. Both Zenzel and Firanda seemed fine but Ice Han was hurt, she saw as she carefully climbed back. He was cradling his arm and bruised across the face. He was also not the source of the shouting. I saw you push him, Shalini insisted, pistol out. I wasn't anywhere near him, your Etsy bit back. Am I to be called a killer because he saw fit to trip? Someone stepped in between them, but by virtue of it being Tupac-sickle it was the opposite of reassuring. Your Etsy is right, the Eastly mused. I'm sure her being a killer is entirely unrelated to Nair being a clumsy fool. The pistol moved off the first Islan to the other, which Angharade knew was the moment Shalini lost the crowd. Tupac was despised, and she suspected only one more incident away from being turned on, but pointing that muzzle at more than one person had made Shalini look overwrought, out of control. It had cost her credibility, and as no one else seemed to have caught what happened, credibility would be what decided the contest. Even as Angharade bit her teeth and wondered how to intervene, Shalini must be wrong. What could your Etsy possibly gain from attacking Ice Han? The claimed victim spoke up by himself. Pistol down, Shalini, Ice Han said, getting to his feet with a wince. I felt something push my back, but I suppose it could have been the wind. There was a breeze, however faint. The other Someshwari looked conflicted, but eventually she noticed the unfriendly looks her waving around a weapon was drawing. With gritted teeth she put away the pistol, and there was a slight adjustment to the order of descent. Your Etsy went behind Angharade, warily eyeing the pair from Ramaya, and the climb down resumed with a broader gap between climbers than ever. No one wanted to earn another accusation. It still took them the better part of an hour to get at the bottom after that. From down there the temple fortress seemed even more towering. Natural stone, touched with red lichen, led them to massive open bronze gates. There were some small ponds of stale water they went around, but soon enough they all gathered before the handful of steps leading into the temple. There was some hesitation, but the walk to the gates had been rest enough and none wanted to spend the day waiting out here. They ventured up the stairs cautiously, past the red stone of the floor and onto the cavernous hall within. Lamps hung from barely seen rafters, casting slices of yellowing light on walls dripping with tapestries and trophies. There seemed to be no rhyme nor reason to what hung there. Angharad saw children's toys side by side with ornate silver bucklers, then a musket besides what she suspected to be a Perduri fertility necklace. Ivory tusks, jewels, blades, all of them placed over spans of wool, linen and silks that depicted everything from wars to the sleeping god's grace descending upon the unworthy. The scale of it should have brought out all, but somehow Angharad could not help but feel as if she were looking at some magpie's trove. At the end of the hall they were treading awaited an audience room, lit by the same hanging lamps, and on the raised dais at the center the noblewoman first saw the spirit they were to bargain with. A vividly colorful bird the size of a carriage, a peafowl whose tail feathers were tucked in, bore on its back a golden cradle, which held the desiccated shape of a man in red silks. Neither spirit nor mount moved as their group approached the threshold of the gate. Angharad, breathing in, crossed it first and offered a respectful bow to the desiccated spirit. "Honored elder, I greet you," she said. There was a long moment of silence, then the bird let out a cackle. "Lower, child," the spirit said. "He has not answered anyone in a great many years." The peafowl spirit's eyes were bright blue and wide open, staring down at her with amusement. Angharad swallowed. "Honored elder, I greet you," she tried. The bird sniffed. "Are you ignoring my master?" it demanded. Angharad swallowed again, unsure how to answer, until the bird began cackling. "That's fine," the peafowl hiccuped. "He's dead." A soft curse in Zamratrova from behind her, which rather echoed how she was feeling. Then Lord Ishan was at her side and bowing through a wince. His arm must still hurt. He said something in the same tongue, which had the peafowl spirit preening and nodding, and so the corpse atop its back shaking around. "She's a Mayura, Lady Tredegar," Ishan then told her in Antigua. "Not exactly a god, since they do not come alone. They are the finest divine mounts to ever exist," the spirit cackled, striking a pose as her tail feathers snapped open in a dazzling display. "Behold my greatness." A moment passed. There was nothing spiritual about the plumage the Perduri was looking at, as far as she could tell. "They are very nice feathers," Angharad finally said. The peafowl preened, shuffling back and forth on her spindly legs. "They serve as the mounts of victory gods," Ishan mildly said. "When surviving their riders they are known to grow eccentric." She glanced sideways at him. "Victory gods? When a great victory is won a god is sometimes born of it," the Someshwari told her. "They are all children of the six-headed one, but have will of their own. They get them out of defeats as well." Angharad turned. Seeing Young had approached while she was distracted. "Some crawling thing came out of the fields at Dayakai, a few weeks after," the Tiangsi told her. "The watch had a free company waiting to kill it. I had not heard, though I see no reason to disbelieve a veteran of the Karel dance," Ishan politely said before his attention returned to her. "I was taught it is not so uncommon phenomenon across the span of Vesper, but that my people's ties to the deeper truths of the orthodoxy makes it more frequent where we rule." The dark-skinned noble could almost hear the echo of 4 acrimonious religious wars, fought and yet to be, in that last sentence. The sleeping god was a blessing in more ways than one. Angharad's eyes slid back to the peafowl, who to her faint surprise did not seem all that put off with a tangent unrelated to her. She was, the Perduri thought, listening to them almost eagerly. "Am I to understand, noble elder, that this temple is now yours?" she asked. "That's right," the peafowl happily said. "The greedy one slurped up Kshetra's insides, but instead of getting its hands on this place the claim passed down to me." Angharad glanced at Ishan to see if the name brought up anything, but he sighed. "It literally means tract of land," he murmured. "There are more minor gods with that name than there are lords in Eastleigh." Ah! She supposed not every battle happened to be fought in a place that bore a proper name. It seemed odd, however, for a minor spirit to have earned such a grand temple. Her momentary distraction was rewarded by another person stepping in, though Song joining them before the spirit was most welcome. "The greedy one," Song repeated. "It is a most fearsome name. Would you tell us of your divine foe, mighty god?" The peafowl preened again, easily flattered. Angharad was beginning to feel a little guilty about this. "It's not a real god," the Mayura contemptuously said. It did not come of the golden egg like we did, taking shape from nothing. It was forged long ago, by the spirit suddenly stopped. No, she said. I keep forgetting, questions only at a price. To go forward, to learn, you must take my tests. The Mayura skipped around the dais, beak pecking at things unseen. Before Angharad could even begin to consider what that was about, cascades of blue and green silk fell down from the ceiling in waves. Fluttering curtains surrounded them on all sides, and the spirit made happy noises. Supplicants, she said. You have come to the temple of the great Kshetra. She shook her back a bit, the desiccated corpse in the cradle jerking around. Should one squint, its arm might have done something akin to a wave. Morbid. A crossroads stands before you, the P30 announced. At the summit of this holy place waits the path that will take you to the end of this maze. Behind her, golden light coursed down the blue silk like rivers. It traced a silhouette, resembling the shape of the temple fortress as they had beheld it outside. 6 plates were haphazardly stacked atop one another, each delineated as its own section, including the hall where they now stood, at the very bottom of the stack. From the tower at the summit a strand of gold unfolded, leading into a curl whose meaning was unclear. There is another path, the Mayura said, for those unfit to brave our tests. At the 3rd level, a strand of gold unfolded and reached out. To the side. There was nothing there, though in her mind's eye Angharad supposed something coming out of the temple horizontally would go into the cliffs. Yellow tiles will lead you back to the very beginning of the maze, the spirit said. A gift from the great Kshetra. Such largesse, however, must be earned. Lord Ishan cleared his throat. How may we earn your grace, great Mayura? Each of the old temples hosts a champion in their test, the P30 told him. To earn the right to climb, you must defeat them. Old temples, Sanglitli said. I thought this all belonged to the great Kshetra's inheritor? The Mayura shifted uneasily. There used to be 12 of us, she said, though. The spirit paused, eyeing Song, and something like anger passed through those blue eyes. You may no longer speak. There was a ripple in the air, the curtains of silk fluttering like an incoming storm, and Song hastily bowed before backing away. The P30 watched her unblinking, the displeased stare pushing Song all the way back to the ranks before releasing her. However fickle the spirit, it had been dangerous of the Tiangsi to attempt to trick her into surrendering secrets for free. Best to change the subject before the Mayura decided to express her displeasure more concretely. Must all 6 tests be passed for us to cross, honored elder? Angharad politely asked. If so, she feared corpses would ensue. The spirit let out a pleased cackle. This is a land of victory, so we honor it above all else, the P30 said. You may instead face a test while under restriction, making your deed all the greater. Angharad cocked her head to the side. Curious as she was to get to the end of this temple, it should be clear to all what was most urgently needed. It certainly was to her. How may one earn the right of passage to the beginning of the maze? She asked. 3 to rise, the Mayura said. Another to cross the gap. Simple enough, a king the test for 1 win, then 3 restrictions to pay for the rest. Then that is the wager I ask of you, Angharad said. To her left Ishan choked. The P30, however, seemed most pleased. Then white attitude. I present you then the challengers, she said, prancing about the stage. The golden light began to twist again, taking the shape of a man. Oh yes, the clever, who you must defeat in a contest of riddles that, next, Angharad said. The giant bird somehow gave the distinct impression of a pout. Light shifted again. Urvashi Cloudfoot, whose deadly race across the sky, not her either, Angharad said. No one ever picks Urvashi, the spirit complained. You should hear her moan about it. The others, honored elder? She pressed. Am Rinder ever champion, whose gift is to know and match your every skill at arms, the P30 tried. He must be defeated in a duel. Startled, she almost laughed. A mirror, was it? Him, Angharad said. I will face him. The Mayura flicked her feathers. A worthy choice, she said. Let us speak of oaths, then. You must give 3. I will use no weapon beyond my saber, Angharad offered. The Peafowl nodded. I receive your oath, she said. The air shivered. I will not use my contract, Angharad offered. The Mayura leaned closer, considering with those large blue eyes, then she opened her beak to taste the air with her tongue. Coolness slithered through her veins, the fisher's attention called, and the Peafowl drew back hastily. Yes, best keep that out of the test, the spirit said. I receive your oath. The air shivered anew. The Angharad hesitated, considering what else she might offer. Somehow she figured leaving behind her coat would not be sufficient, however fine a coat it might be. An answer came from a most unexpected helper. Spare the champion, Tupac suggested. She turned, frowning. Pull a killing blow, he clarified. That sounded surprisingly sensible. She turned to the spirit, silently asking if such an oath would be received. The Mayura considered it, then slowly nodded. Twice, she said. Pull a killing blow twice. She did not flinch in the face of the terms. What was there to fear, facing herself in a mirror? Agreed. Then I receive your oath, the Mayura said. Follow me, I shall show you the way. The rest of you can wait here. The spirit led her through halls of red stone, sloping and turning in ways that did not fit what she had seen from the outside. It was constantly chattering, and oddly insistent that Angharad be the one who take the test should her group attempt to reach the summit of the temple. When she dared ask why, the Mayura was only too happy to explain. If you die here I will gobble up the corpse, she said, but the last test is different. The wager is that those who fail it will become a champion of this temple. The Mayura happily pattered about, missing the horror on Angharad's face. You seem like you would be pleasant to keep, she said. So try not to lose until that test, yes? The spirit then flicked her wing, ushering her forward into a doorway of redstone. Amrinder waits within, she said. Angharad went through. It was a graveyard. Walls of bare stone closed in from all sides, solemnly leaning over a field of ash. Scorched bones peeked out of the gray like lurid smiles, pierced and broken by weapons enough to fight a war, swords and spears, curved knives and axes and broken butlers. A war was fought here, Angharad thought. One corpse at a time. Ash creaked under her boots as she approached the specter at the heart of it all, sitting on a mound of cinders and steel. A stern-faced bearded man with long unbound hair waited. A faded red and yellow vest covered a long padded tunic touched with bronze scales, but it was the worn banner the man had wrapped himself in that caught her eye. Even color had long dripped out of the cloth, leaving behind stale paleness that spoke of nothing but use. My name, the specter said, is Amrinder. May you perish bravely. A mirror has no name, Angharad simply replied, and drew her sword. The man shook himself to his feet, the banner fluttering down into the ash. He was taller than her, Angharad thought, though not by much. Lightly, almost daintily he plucked out of the ash a curved blade that resembled her own saber. She closed the distance. Skill, for your age, the specter said, as if tasting her talent. But I am that and more. Arrogance makes for quick contests. 10 feet lay between them. It was nothing at all. It was the entire world. 2 steps, measured, and Angharad's saber began to rise towards a duelist's salute. Amrinder matched her, only for his eyes to narrow when she immediately darted forward and hacked at the side of his neck. Left hand parry, but his blade was thicker and slower. It kept her off his throat, but only until she pivoted behind him and brought the bottom of her blade, near the guard, to rest against the nape of his neck. 1, Angharad counted, and drew back as he chased her off with a swing. She could have carved into his spine, if she so wished. Have you no honor? The specter bit out. The strike during, a mirror has no honor, she replied. Fury on the stern face, thick black brows pulling angrily. He pursued, high guard mirroring her own, and across the ash they danced. 10 feet, Angharad measured again as she slipped under a blow and the hem of her coat brushed against the ash. The spectre left no footsteps, but the strength of his blows kicked up slashes of cold ash, half a breath brush strokes, traced and blotted by the same wink of steel. Parry, cut and spin with the spectre's long blow. He might not tire, but for all his thicker arms he was slower, his blade not as slender, his footing not as fine. The spectre swept his guard low, inviting the blow, and she took the invitation. A feint near the head, immediately drawing an upwards cut at her belly, but she caught and swept it to the side. In the moment when he drew back his head to slam it into her own, she brought up her free hand and slapped him on the side of the throat. The spectre choked, half stumbling, and before he could steady his footing, Angharad took half a step backwards, disengaging her blade and pulling back her arm. The point came to rest against the hollow of his throat. 2, Angharad counted, and gave ground. Ash flew as the spectre's anger swept the grounds, dark eyes grown wild as he slashed away, and she maintained her distance. 10 feet, no more, no less. There is a trick, the spectre said. A contract. How else could you prevail twice? It is not obvious. Angharad asked. The spectre's blade slowed, wary but listening. Her eyes met his. You were fighting as a rendition of me, the mirror dancer calmly replied, when I am already the finest such rendition. And to her surprise, that gave him pause. Anger bled out of the bearded man's face, leaving behind the bones of soft rue. I had forgot, he said, blade lowering. She cocked her head to the side, her guard up. He smiled. What it felt like, the sting of pride. His thick saber slid out of his grip, down into the ash, and the spectre turned his back to her. She could have struck, Angharad knew. Pierced through him from behind. The fisher's answer, victory at any cost. So instead she stood there as the spectre returned to his seat and gently took up the banner, carefully brushing away every trace of ash. He wrapped it around his shoulders until it settled as a loose half-cape, trailing behind. Only then did he climb to the summit of the mound, where lay a wooden shaft. It was ripped free, revealing a long spear ending in a spearhead thick and long as a hand. The spectre, readied at last, turned to her again. My name is Amrinder, he said, hoisting his spear. When the city fell and they came for the Maharana, I held the garden alone until the nightingales sang. Her saber rose to tap against her left shoulder, a salute ode. Lady Angharad Tredegar of Lan Hall, she replied. 10 times have I danced with the mirror. You are a fool, Lady Tredegar, Amrinder laughed, for a heartbeat young. May you win. Angharad breathed out, taking 3 steps forward as she chose a fresh distance to engage from, and in the heartbeat that followed she nearly died. The movement as Amrinder came down the mount was fluid, almost hypnotic, and as her eyes struggled to follow the head of the spear she realized too late she was misjudging his reach. The step back she took by reflex turned a thrust that would have gone through her throat into one that sliced along the side of her neck. Amrinder drew back his spear as she swallowed, bringing up her guard as blood began trickling down her skin. A spirit of fear, but stillborn. There was no musket here, no throng of enemies and no wicked contract. A man and a field, that was all that faced her. Life and death were in her own hands. Angharad breathed out. The dance began anew. He was better with his spear than Tupac. Faster, more polished and full of tricks. A sweep kicked up a cloud of ash into her face, but catching the glint of steel through allowed a narrow parry, her riposte catching only the banner's fluttering cloth. When she gave ground he pursued, when she pressed forward he circled to harass her legs, twice scoring shallow cuts, and when she maneuvered for a better angle he mirrored her smoothly. Trying to follow the tip with her eyes was death. It wove, dazzling and smooth and always a foot closer to her flesh than it seemed. Sweat trickled down her back and Angharad's breathing grew labored while Amrinder fought with the tirelessness of the dead, but fear found no purchase in her. There was a weakness, she thought. And she thought she might have caught a glimpse of it earlier, when he almost slew her. The angle of the thrust had been slightly off. He pulls to the left. It took her 3 bouts and a rip into the hem of her coat before she found the ground she needed. The axe buried into a skull she ignored, but the ornate halberd and the 3 swords, standing together like grave markers, drew her footsteps. She moved and watched and waited, eyes on his arms and not his spear. Unlike the spearhead, those did not lie. Angharad pressed forward and the spectre circled to the left, so immediately she gave ground. He pursued, as he always did, and then came the breath that would kill or crown her. Amrinder thrust forward viper swift, feet leaving not a trace on the ash, and Angharad stepped into it. She had meant to avoid the steel entirely, but the spearhead was too broad. It carved into the side of her vest instead of getting caught in her coat like she had wanted. Either way, gritting her teeth through the pain as she felt steel bite into the flesh above her ribs, she bunched up her coat and caught the spear. The spectre, without hesitation, took a step back to rip his spear free. And Angharad won. He had gone around the jutting swords without thought, pursuing her, but then he had struck at her, and when striking, Amrinder pulled to the left. So now he stepped back right into the swords he had avoided, tripping, and Angharad burst forward with a shout. Arm thrusting forward, point straight, she rammed her saber into the spectre's heart even as his back hit the ash. It went through the padded armor, into what should have been flesh but was nothing at all. It was as if Angharad had struck air, and air was what her eyes found. "Oh," Amrinder gasped, eyes smiling. A heartbeat later she was looking down at nothing but a faded banner, breathing raggedly. Angharad fell to her knees in the ash, eyes closed and shivered as the sudden coolness of the air. Victory. The peafowl was waiting for her beyond the doorway. Very exciting, she chattered as she led Angharad back down. It was delicious to watch. The P30 tugged her coat closed around her. Now that her sweat had cooled, she was stinking and cold. Your companions thought the same, the mayor added. Angharad's steps stuttered. I do not take your meaning, honored elder, she said. They watched as well, the mayor lightly said. I could not give them the sounds the Wakshatra used to, but moving shapes as well within my power. The golden light, Angharad thought, the one that had moved like water. Had she done anything foolish? The noblewoman was still wondering whether she should be mortified when the spirit led her back to the others. Her half-formed fears melted away when a crowd formed around her in the blink of an eye, everyone seeming to want to pat her back or talk to her. It was a little overwhelming, so she was grateful when Isabel took her by the arm and tugged her back a little. The crowd calmed after a few more moments, and then it was Angharad's turn to speak. She had passed the test, so now she wanted the prize. The spirit did not quibble, though already she spoke of when they would all return. Once the mayor showed them to the right hall, the way forward was simple. Up 2 flights of stairs they went, then to a slender drawbridge of white wood that was already lowered when they arrived. They crossed it into the left side of the great cliffs surrounding the temple, through an empty shrine where the wind echoed like eerie bells. From there on, just as the spirit had promised, yellow tiles marked a path forward. It took them through stairs and shrines, then up on a great ridge made from the collapsed dome of a temple. It was one of the very highest points of the maze, enough they could dimly make out a sprawl in every direction, and in the golden light of the other machine they made out a descending path. Following the yellow tiles, which grew rarer and rarer, but never ceased, they stayed on a high road of ceilings and empty ruins for half a day's worth of walking, only taking a break to eat. Come what should be late afternoon, Angharad recognized her first shrine, the curved one where Lady Inyani had fallen to the test of the cog god. Passing that observation along revived everyone's flagging vigor and they redoubled their efforts. The very last yellow tile, found after the tiring climb down a flight of stairs so large they might as well have been walls, led them all atop the narrow passage that they knew was the Serpent Shrine. They were back, the distant lights of the old fort beckoning them to safety. Sung and Angharad were the first to take the rope down and they stayed together as everyone gathered to head back to the fort. Both were too tired to chat. The last quarter-hour walk back stretched an eternity, but as the blast cloaks on the wall greeted them with waves Angharad let out a long breath. They passed through the breach in the rampart, returning to sanctuary, and treading the ground of the courtyard loosened something in the noblewoman's shoulders. Knowing there were muskets on the walls, that the watch would see to their safety, was a comfort. I think might take a nap, she told Song. It is unseemly, I know, but I am falling to pieces. The Tianxi did not reply, and when Angharad turned curiously she saw that Song held herself tensely. She was staring behind them and the P30 followed her gaze to find it was resting on the laggards of their group, Lam, Akanthi, Felis. One of the blast cloaks guarding the entrance, a young man with the Milani look, laid a hand on Felly's chest as he crossed the breach. The man glowered, all the more when the watchman took a sniff of him and then a second. The Sacramontan said something Angharad could not hear, and it must have scared the blessed cloak, for he drew back. No, Angharad realized. The young Milani was looking elsewhere, towards the barracks. Against their wall Lieutenant Wen was leaning, eating from a bowl of those horrid mushroom crisps Lierganese were so fond of. The young watchman nodded and went aside before raising his hand. Last one in. The Tiangxi shouted. Felly's eyes widened. Angharad saw it even from where she stood. Wait, no, The fat lieutenant's hand came down and 36 muskets thundered. Smoke billowed out in plumes from every direction, spreading through the utter silence of the courtyard, and Felly's mangled body dropped to the